At sunrise, throw into the sea of beneficence every kind of food for the beings called fishes. But the most peculiar of all was the custom of paying attention to the voices of beings of other forms. As soon as they heard the voice of a being of any form, they immediately began to praise the names of their gods and to await their blessing. It might be the crowing of a cock, the barking of a dog, the mewing of a cat, the squealing of an ape, or so on. It would always startle them. Here it is interesting to notice that for some reason or other they would always, on these occasions, raise their heads and look upwards, even though, according to the teaching of their religion, their God and his assistants were supposed to exist on the same level as themselves, and not where they directed their eyes in prayers. It was extremely interesting at these moments to watch their faces. "Pardon me, your right reverence," interrupted at that moment Beelzebub's old devoted servant Ahun, who had also been listening with great interest to his tales. "Do you remember, your right reverence, how many times in that same city Gob we ourselves had to flop down in the streets during the cries of beings of different forms?" To this remark Beelzebub said, "Certainly I remember, dear Ahun. How could I forget such comical impressions?" "You must know," he then continued, turning to Hussein again, "that the beings of the planet Earth are inconceivably proud and touchy. If someone does not share their views or agree to do as they do, or criticizes their manifestations, they are, very indignant and offended. If one had the power, he would order whoever dared not to do as he did, or who criticized his conduct, to be shut up in the kind of room which is usually infested by innumerable what are called rats and lice. And at times, if the offended one had greater physical strength, and an important power-possessing being with whom he was not on very good terms was not watching him, he would simply maul the offender as the Russian Sidor once mauled his favorite goat. Very well knowing this aspect also of their strange psyche, I had no desire to offend them and to incur their wrath. Furthermore, I was always profoundly aware that to outrage anybody's religious feelings is contrary to all morality. So, when existing among them, I always tried to do as they did, in order not to be conspicuous and attract attention. Here it does no harm to notice that owing to existing abnormal conditions of ordinary existence there among your favorites, the three-brained beings of that strange planet Earth, especially during recent centuries, only those beings who manifest themselves not as the majority of them do, but somehow or other more absurdly, become noticed and consequently honored by the rest. And the more absurd their manifestations, and the more stupid, mean, and insolent the tricks they play, the more noticed and famous they become. And the greater is the number of beings on the given continent, and even on other continents, who know them personally, or at least by name. On the other hand, no honest being who does not manifest himself absurdly will ever become famous among other beings, or even be simply noticed, however good-natured and sensible he may be in himself. And so, my boy, what our Ahun so mischievously reminded me about concerned just that custom which developed there in the city Gob, of attaching significance to the voices of beings of various forms, and particularly to the voice of what are called donkeys, of which there were then, for some reason or other, a great many in the city Gob. The beings of all other forms of that planet also manifest themselves by voice, but at a definite time. For instance, the cock cries at midnight, an ape in the morning when it is hungry, and so on. But donkeys there bray whenever it enters their heads to do so, and in consequence you may hear the voice of that silly being there at any time of day or night. So, my boy, it was established there in the city Gobe that as soon as the sound of the voice of the donkey was heard, all who heard it had to flop down immediately and offer up prayers to their God and to their revered idols. And I must add, these donkeys usually have a very loud voice by nature, and their voices carry a long way. Well, then as we walked along the streets of the city Gobe and saw the citizens flopping down at the braying of every donkey, we had flopped down likewise, so as not to be distinguished from the others, and it was just this comical custom, I see now, that tickled our old Ahun so much. You noticed, my dear Hussein, with what venomous satisfaction our old man reminded me after so many centuries of that comical situation of mine. Having said this, Beelzebub, smiling, went on with the tale he had begun. It is needless to say, he continued, that there also, in this second center of culture of the three-brained beings of your planet, breeding there on the continent of Ashark, the destruction of beings of other forms for sacrificial offerings entirely ceased. And if isolated instances occurred, the beings of that group themselves settled accounts with the offenders without compunction. Having thus become convinced that there also among that second group of beings of the continent Ashark, I had succeeded so easily in uprooting for a long time the custom of sacrificial offerings, I decided to leave. But I had it in mind in any event to visit also the nearest large points where the beings of the same second group were breeding. And I chose for this purpose the region of the course of the river Nariachi. Soon after this decision I sailed with Ahun to the mouth of this river and began to sail up against its current, having become persuaded that there had already passed from the beings of the city Gobe to the beings of this group populating these large centers the same new customs and the same notions concerning sacrificial offerings by the destruction of the existence of other beings. We finally arrived at a small town called Argenia, which in those days was considered the most remote point of the country Maralplesi. Here also there existed a fair number of beings of this second Asiatic group who were engaged chiefly in obtaining from nature what is called turquoise. There in the small town Argenia, I began, as usual, to visit their various chaihana, and there also I continued my usual procedure.